So welcome to the EdPuzzle on circulation, circulatory system. This is going to be a brief overview of sort of general anatomy, focusing on human circulatory system, so heart and arteries and veins and so on. And we're going to focus in mostly on how the heartbeat is regulated and how our bodies control blood flow from our heart to different parts of our body, such as extremities and our lungs. Okay, so a circulatory system is basically they link exchange systems, so gas exchange, nutrient exchange, waste disposal to the rest of the body. So this is a way for multicellular organisms like people and anything thicker than about 2 or 3 cells, to be honest, to be able to get all of the things that those cells need when they're not in direct contact with the outside world or in direct contact with a source for those nutrients or those gases and so on, right? So we've got cells that are kind of locked away in different parts of our body, and the circulatory system is essentially a way we have of bringing to those cells all the things that they need, nutrients, oxygen, etc., and taking away any waste that we want to dispose of, for example, urea or carbon dioxide. So it's a way for cells to get what they need and to continue functioning and living and dividing and sort of metabolizing normally. While they are not necessarily in direct contact with, the soup of nutrients in your intestine or the air in your lungs and so on. And of course, again, animals that are more than a few cells thick have to have some sort of circulatory system. In some animals, this is an open circulatory system, so it's basically just fluid that kind of sloshes around and moves things around that way. Most animals that move with purpose, so our bilaterally symmetrical animals that swim, walk, fly, whatever, most of those kinds of animals, again, who are thicker than a couple of cells, so flatworms don't have a lot of these systems. They don't have a circulatory system, really, because they don't need one. But most more complicated animals do, and most have what's called a closed circulatory system. So you essentially have a network of tubes that are filled with fluid, and that fluid, again, is in contact or has proximity to, for example, the air in our lungs. The gas diffuses across a very thin layer of epithelial cells into the interstitial fluid between the cells and into our blood supply. And so then that gets picked up, right, and carried elsewhere in the body. Same goes for nutrients coming in from our digestive system and waste getting filtered through our kidneys. We have a blood supply in close proximity to transport epithelia. There are epithelial cells that function to transport nutrients, etc. And they're sort of the go-between between the outside world and our circulatory system. So this is a fluid-filled system that's under pressure, right? You have a pump that is then circulating, and this is why we call it a circulatory system. It's circulating that fluid all through the body, so that as the pump works, it moves the blood, in this case, fluid from the heart to our lungs and our brain and everywhere else, so that all those cells get exactly what they need, right? And again, we can pick up wastes. So this is a closed circulatory system. So as we were talking about earlier in class, we talked about blood clots forming where they shouldn't form, right? So if one forms in the middle of one of our blood vessels, right, that's going to cut off blood flow to a particular part of the body or all of the body or to the heart, wherever that clot happens to form. You can also have what's called an air embolism form, and then basically a bubble that forms. And you wouldn't think an air bubble could be deadly, but it most certainly can be, because again, this is a closed system. So you've just injected air into this closed system somehow, and that is essentially functioning like a clot. So depending on where the air bubble is, it can cause serious damage. Okay, so what does the structure of our circulatory system look like, right? So typical cardiovascular system, right? We have our big pump, which is our heart, right? And then all the tube network. It's going to carry the blood supply from the heart to everywhere in the body. And so what we find is the transport tubes start off pretty big in terms of diameter, right? They often have thick reinforced walls on your arteries. So arteries carry blood away from the heart. So I always think about, artery away to the organs. And as they branch and go everywhere, right? So you have branches that go down each arm and some that go to your brain and some that go to the rest of your body. Those branches are going to be, start to get smaller in diameter. They're called arterioles. And eventually you end up with vessels that are so small, they're microscopically small, and they're about as big around, just a slightly larger diameter than a single red blood cell, for example. So your red blood cells basically go through your capillaries more or less one at a time. And this, of course, is why when we were talking about sickle cell, right, those folks have so much problems with clotting, because their red blood cells are shaped sort of funny and they tend to get stuck in the capillaries and they bunch up together and you get, basically not so much a clot in the traditional sense, but definitely a bunching up of red blood cells in places that they shouldn't, which is going to be blocking oxygen supply and blood flow. So capillaries, it's important to note, again, very thin, small vessels. So these are vessels that have a lot of surface area for a very small amount of volume, which makes them really good for exchanging gases, for example, and having things move in and out. Capillaries tend to be a little bit leaky, meaning that the walls of the capillaries are somewhat porous. And so that actually is a good thing in terms of letting nutrients out and potentially other things, such as some of the white blood cells, our immune system, letting them get much closer to cells than they would be if there was this sort of thick wall in between. And then we have the returning blood supply. So capillary beds are, again, the network of capillaries that are responsible for supplying blood to our different organs and tissues and dropping off the nutrients, again, picking up waste. And then the capillaries give way as we're coming back to the heart to venules, which is basically the vein version of an arteriole. So it's sort of a medium-sized tube. Veins are not reinforced the same way that arteries are because the blood pressure has dropped by the time that blood has sort of wandered through the capillary beds, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And then, of course, veins are responsible for carrying blood supply back to the heart, where it can then be redistributed elsewhere. So hearts typically have at least 2 chambers. Very, very simple hearts have an atrium and a ventricle. We have 4 chambers in our heart. So we have 2 atria and 2 ventricles. There are other animals that have a 3-chambered heart as well, but we have 4. So we have 2 atria and we have 2 ventricles. So the atria are receiving blood from the veins and ventricles are then sending it out elsewhere. Okay, so mammals and some other animals use a process called double circulation. What that means is we have 2 separate blood circuits that are basically combining or coming together in our heart. So we have one circuit that pumps from the heart to the lungs and to do gas exchange, and then comes back to the heart, and then the other circuit goes from the heart out to the rest of the body and then comes back to the heart, right? So the right side of the heart is going to be pumping oxygen poor blood to the lungs. So this again is, we typically show this in illustrations, right, as, red is oxygen rich and blue is oxygen poor. There is some, obviously there's some color change in terms of the pigments in your red blood cells, predominantly hemoglobin, when it has offloaded its oxygen supply and is no longer bound to oxygen. So it actually reflects a light differently, and we perceive a different color. So we have our oxygen poor blood going, again, from the heart. So it's coming back from the body, comes through our right atrium to our right ventricle, which then pumps the blood forcefully to through the pulmonary circuit. So this is our pulmonary artery going to the lungs, right? And then we, of course, have that lovely site of gas exchange. So we have very thin transport epithelia between the air in our lungs and our capillary beds in your lungs with the alveoli sacs with that high surface area to volume ratio to maximize gas exchange across the surface. And of course, we've got a lot more oxygen in the air that we breathe than in the blood supply that's going to our lungs. So the oxygen is going to diffuse into our bloodstream, which increases the oxygen supply in our blood. And of course, that means the hemoglobin is picking up that oxygen, and that oxygenated blood is then going to be returning to our left side of our heart through the left atrium, through the left ventricle, which is slightly larger than the right ventricle, and then pumped very forcefully out our aorta to basically, and which then branches to several different parts so that it can carry oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, that travels through capillary beds and in our different tissues and picks up, drops off the oxygen, picks up the waste products, and brings those back. Drops off, picks up the waste products, then it's going to stop by the kidneys and drop off those waste products. And possibly go to the liver as well, and then return to the heart. So in between heartbeats, our blood is going to flow into the atria. So both atria are going to fill in that relaxation. So you have basically contraction is the beating, right? So you have contraction that's forcing the blood from the atria into the ventricle, for example. And once you do that, and then you relax the atrium, right? So the atria relax, and that allows blood to then flow into the atria or the ventricle, but first the atrium, and then we contract again, and that pushes the blood from the ventricles out to, again, either the lungs or to the rest of the body. And then, of course, when that muscle relaxes, then you can move. That will be followed by filling of the ventricle with fluid from the atrium. So atria have thinner walls and they're smaller. Ventricles, of course, are going to be thicker, and the contraction is much more forceful with our ventricles than it is with the atria, which makes sense. You know, contracting the atria, they just have to move move blood from the atrium to the ventricle. Contracting the ventricle, that blood's got to go a good distance, right? It has to go to our lungs, or it has to go to the rest of our body. So it has to provide enough pressure to move that blood through the tubes to its destination. So in between your atria and your ventricles are valves, and these valves are basically flaps of connective tissue that are only open from one side. So they're basically a one-way door, and when they shut, they sort of slam back shut. So they don't generally bend backwards, which is a good thing. Usually. And that generally means that you're going to have one-way blood flow, right? So your blood flowing from the atrium to the ventricle, but not the other way around, hopefully, at any point, right? And so again, when the atria contract, the valves are forced open. That allows the blood to flow from the atrium to the ventricle, and then as the atrium relaxes, the valve slams shut, right? And then, of course, you have that followed by a contraction of the ventricle, which forces the next valve open, allowing the blood to flow from the ventricle, out of the heart. And then as the ventricle relaxes, the valve slams shut. So our atrioventricular valves, aka the AV valves, right, are the first one, right? Those are the ones between the atrium and the ventricle. And of course, this again prevents, when they shut, that prevents the flow of blood from going back into the atria. Likewise, our semilunar valves, these are the valves between basically the boundary of the ventricle and the exit to the heart. So the aorta leaves the left ventricle, so we have a semilunar valve between the ventricle and the aorta. We have another one between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery. And so again, contraction by the ventricle opens the valve, and then as the ventricle relaxes, then the valve shuts. And of course, it's what we're hearing when your heart is beating. You're not hearing the contraction of the muscles of your heart. You're hearing the valves slamming shut. So hopefully, what you hear is a lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. Right. So the lub is the AV valves, and the dub is the semilunar valves, and they should be opening and closing at the same time as the other one, roughly, right? So both of your atria contract at the same time, and both of your ventricles contract at the same time. So here I've got a little video that goes over the flow of blood in the heart, and of course the valves. It gives different names. Pardon me. It gives different names for the valves. They're more specific. You don't need to know those. But it does have a really nice overview of how we regulate our heartbeat. Okay, so the completion of what we refer to as a cardiac cycle is one complete sequence of pumping and filling. So you fill the atria, right? You contract, you move the blood from the atria to the ventricles, and then the AV valves shut, and then you contract ventricles, and that forces the blood in the ventricles out to their destination, right? The lungs or the rest of your body. So that whole cycle we refer to as the cardiac cycle. And this, in terms of your blood flow, this means that you are every beat, right? Heartbeat is you're counting the lub-dubs, right? So each of those. Typically what you are feeling when you're taking your pulse, for example, is the contraction, the increase in pressure from the contraction of the ventricles. So that is your systolic blood pressure. You know, you take your blood pressure and you get that, 120 over 80, right? So the 120 is the pressure in your arteries after the ventricles contract. So that's the highest point, right? Because again, that blood's got to go all over your body, right? So you have enough pressure in those vessels to get the blood from the heart to where it needs to go. And then the relaxation, right? This is when the ventricles relax, right? And so basically when both sides of your heart are relaxed, then the pressure is going to be at the lowest point, and that's your diastolic pressure, right? Kind of your standing pressure in your blood vessels, right? So typically, right, that's about 80 millimeters of mercury, and systolic is usually about 120. So it's sort of considered normal. Again, people may vary a little bit around that. So as I mentioned, one cardiac cycle is basically one complete pumping and filling of your heart. Your cardiac output is the volume of blood that's pumped per minute. So typically for people, this is about 5 liters per minute. And typically we have about 5 liters of blood in our body. So all of your blood goes through your heart in 1 minute, but not in one cardiac cycle, right? Not all at once. Obviously that would be crazy, high volume there to go through your heart in 1 minute. So it typically takes about 75 beats per minute to complete a cardiac, complete your full cardiac output, right? So typically you're going to be doing about 5 liters per minute. A portion of that is being moved every single time your heart beats, and it's typically about 75 beats to get that blood to circulate through your heart, all the blood in your body to have gone through your heart in 1 minute, right? Now again, that resting level may be lower or higher depending on a variety of factors, right? And of course, it's going to be higher if you are exercising or exerting yourself in any way. So I did mention, right, and they mentioned in the video, right, we have the valves in between your atria and your ventricles, and we have valves between the ventricles and the arteries that lead away from the heart. Those are supposed to be one-way valves, right? They're supposed to have blood only flowing in one direction. It should be flowing out and not flowing backwards. Now, what you can have, though, is any sort of damage or malformed valves. Again, this could be damage as a result of disease, some other injury, some cases these are just congenital issues, that's something you were born with. My mother has one of those. So she has a defective heart valve. And so when you listen to her heart, you don't hear lub-dub. You hear lub-whoosh-dub. So the whooshing noise is what we refer to as a heart murmur. So this means that a little bit of blood is leaking backwards into the previous chamber, right? So you could also have lub-dub whoosh, right, which would mean you have a leaky ventricular valve, and it's allowing some blood from your arteries to leak back into your ventricle. For most people, under most conditions, this is not that big of a deal, but it is something that definitely you want to be aware of, and your doctor's going to want to be aware of, especially if you have to have surgery, or if you find yourself needing to exert yourself for any strenuously. So again, if you have one, I wouldn't be overly concerned, but it is something that you may need to bear in mind, that you basically have a leaky valve in your heart. So what regulates our heartbeat? How fast it beats, and whether the atria contract together like they're supposed to, and the ventricles contract together like they're supposed to. We are getting signals to our heart from our brain, but your heart also has essentially an internal pacemaker of its own. So we have some cardiac muscle cells that are located in the right atrium in an area that's referred to as the sinoatrial node, or SA node. And these cells can contract and relax without signals from the nervous system. They're essentially setting up their own set of electrical signals, which they then pass to the rest of the heart muscle. Now, when these signals may get out of sync with each other or confused, so this may lead to irregular signals that are coming from the SA node, causing your heart to beat irregularly, right? So the beating of one section may speed up with relation to the other, and so on. And this is a process that's called fibrillation. And again, you're getting an irregular heartbeat. This is real cause for concern, because fibrillation often causes your heart to actually stop beating, meaning it's not going to respond to signals coming from your brain. It just stops completely, which of course we all know is pretty deadly, right? That means you're going to need to restart the heart somehow, either through CPR or somehow, so providing an electrical stimulus somehow to set up those contractions again so that they're synchronized. The fact that your heart has its own internal signals as to when to contract and relax explains why your heart can keep beating after your brain is no longer functioning, right? So you can be brain dead and your body, your heart keeps beating, and it can keep beating for a number of minutes, sometimes a little bit longer than that, actually. Which is somewhat surprising, but that explains why that's possible, because your heart has an internal mechanism, and so it helps to set the rate and the timing of contractions for your cardiac muscle cells, and produces electrical impulses that are similar to those in nerves. And remember, when we were looking at the tissue types and we were looking at our types of muscle, we noticed that cardiac muscle, right, had those intercalated discs, right, in between the bundles of cardiac muscle. And so these are where you have those, you often have gap junctions between the cells, and that allows the electrical impulses from the SA node to spread to the rest of the heart, which again helps to synchronize the heartbeat, right? So that both atria contract together and then they relax, and both ventricles contract together and then they relax, and you keep going this way. The impulses from the SA node are conducted to the skin by body fluids, basically all the fluid around the sac around your heart, which is not a lot of fluid, but a little bit. And of course, you know, it's then in fairly close proximity to the outside of your skin, basically. And this means that we can actually put little sensors, little electrodes on your skin and measure the conduction from the SA node. So you can essentially get the electrical impulses picked up to determine whether your heart is beating regularly or not, and how exactly those electrical impulses are being sent. So this may be something that testing that you go through if anyone's worried about an irregular heartbeat or anything like that. They will subject you to an EKG, which stands for electrocardiogram. Cardio is spelled with a K in German, and this was a German scientist discovered this, so that's why it's called the EKG and not an ECG. Now this is different from an electroencephalogram, which is an EEG, and that's something that measures the electrical impulses in your brain. So it's measuring your brain activity. An EKG is measuring your heart activity. Okay, so what else regulates your heartbeat? Again, you have this internal SA node, but the SA node itself is affected by hormones that are coming in from the rest of your body that may stimulate it to speed up. So for example, in response to epinephrine, which is part of your fight or flight response, those hormones will affect the SA node by causing it to accelerate your heartbeat. Again, you want to make sure that that both sides of your heart are beating in synchrony, right? You don't want fibrillation. You don't want things to be out of sync, but you may need to speed it up or slow it down. The AV node is going to act like a relay point, basically between the SA node and the rest of the heart. So the SA node creates these electrical impulses. They flow through the atria and then through the AV node and then to the ventricles. And again, that's allowing for coordination of the impulses and coordination of beating of your heart. In general, again, hormones can affect the function of the SA node. You have two different sort of branches of your nervous system, and then we're going to talk about this more on the last day of class when we talk about action potentials and our nervous system. So sympathetic nerves basically tend to speed up the pacemaker, increasing the heart rate, and parasympathetic nerves work in the opposite way. They work to slow down your heart rate. So typically, for example, when you're going to bed at night, you have parasympathetic nerves are activated. As you start getting towards going to sleep and you're calming down, it's going to slow your heart rate down. You're not hopefully running a marathon in your sleep. So you don't need to have your heart beating as quickly as you do when you wake up. And so when you wake up in the morning and you go to sit up, you have sympathetic nerves that are accelerating your heart rate so that you have enough oxygen to pump to your brain and everywhere else so that you don't pass out when you first sit up. In the morning, you've already accelerated your heart rate, so you're getting enough oxygen supply. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about the structure of the heart, but I'd like to talk a little bit about the structure of our blood vessels. So as you can imagine, Arteries and veins have a much wider diameter compared to capillaries, which makes sense, right? Capillaries, as you can see in the picture here in the bottom, there's a capillary, and you'll notice that the red blood cells are going through basically one at a time. Single file, that's all there is room for. Whereas, of course, there's a lot more room in your veins and arteries for significant volume of blood, right, which is red blood cells and white blood cells and all the stuff that's in the plasma, all those other molecules, et cetera, moving through those tubes. So again, much larger diameter for the arteries and the veins compared to the capillaries. So again, capillaries is where all the diffusion action is going to happen. You have a very thin wall of endothelium. This is basically just a layer of epithelial cells. I was surrounded by sort of an outer layer of connective tissue, which is also fairly thin. So again, a large surface area, right? Very thin little tubes, and so this is prime territory. As we mentioned earlier, they leak a little bit, right? So prime territory for all this gas and nutrient exchange to happen via diffusion. So the capillaries generally are interacting with, sometimes directly interacting with cells, but sometimes they're interacting with the interstitial fluid around the cells, right? And that's this fluid that's getting concentrated with nutrients and oxygen, but also for cells that are doing lots of metabolism, right? You might have urea and carbon dioxide building up in that interstitial fluid. And if you're operating everything by diffusion, right, for the most part, that means everything's going to go from high concentration to low concentration. So areas where there's lots of metabolic activity happening, you have a lot of carbon dioxide being produced, you're going to have more CO2 in the interstitial fluid than in your blood supply that's nicely oxygenated coming from the heart. And so that means the carbon dioxide is going to diffuse into those capillaries, right? And we will talk in class about how that affects the structure of your hemoglobin, such that it allows oxygen to leave hemoglobin and dissolve into the interstitial fluid and get to the cells that are doing all of that metabolic activity. So again, arteries and veins are thicker, that layer of endothelium surrounded by a layer of smooth muscle, remembering that smooth muscle is generally surrounding and lining cavities and compartments. So our digestive tract, our stomach, and of course our arteries and our veins, so that we can control the diameter of those blood vessels and hence the pressure in those blood vessels as well. So you all notice the layer of smooth muscle around our arteries and our veins, right? Notice we don't have one around the capillaries, right? You don't want anything to be in between as little in between the two liquid masses as possible, so you can maximize diffusion. But what you do want is to be able to manipulate the volume and pressure in your other tubes, right? The arteries and possibly the veins as well. Because of course, if you're increasing your heart rate, you may need to actually increase the volume of liquid that's running through your arteries and your veins if you want to try and deliver maximum oxygen, let's say, to skeletal muscle or other body parts, right? So basically when you, if the volume is the same, right, and this is typically the case, if you constrict, right, the blood vessel. So vasoconstriction is constriction of the smooth muscle surrounding your veins and arteries, and that means that you are increasing the pressure. The volume again is the same, and so therefore the same amount basically going through a smaller area means it has to go through faster, right? So this is kind of analogous to if anybody would, sprayed their friends, siblings, whatever, played with the hose when you were a kid, right? So you have the hose going, and the hose is a fixed volume. excuse me, fixed diameter rather. And so when it's coming out of the hose, depending on how, the volume of water coming out of the hose, it's going to come out at sort of a set rate, and it might be a relatively low rate, and it's kind of bubbling up. But if you put your finger, and you don't constrict the hose itself, but you just put your finger over the opening, right? So now you have suddenly constricted that hole. It's the same volume of liquid that's going through it, and so it has to go through faster, right? So instead of just slowly flowing out, it then sprays everywhere, right? So you increase the pressure in your in the hose, which if sort of you think about analogous to same thing in our arteries and veins. So when we constrict it, we are increasing the pressure, and then that liquid has to go faster, right? Conversely, if we dilate, right? So if you dilate your blood vessels, that is going to increase, that's going to decrease the pressure. And so the fluid is going to, again, same amount, but it's going to be going through more slowly. It's going to slow down. And what actually happens as you have blood going through your capillaries and through the capillary beds, you have so many little tiny vessels that have your main vessels have branched into, that the blood actually, instead of, again, smaller volume, and instead of going through more quickly, it goes through more slowly. So your blood actually slows down going through your capillaries. And there's, again, so many capillaries that the total blood volume actually increases. So at any given time in our bodies, right, a good chunk of our blood is actually wandering through our capillary beds that are feeding into, say, our lungs or our digestive system or our kidneys or our liver and so on. And that's actually good. That's actually something we want. We want the blood to kind of take its time going through that, because that means we have plenty of time for gas exchange to happen, right? Or nutrient exchange to happen. We don't want necessarily, if we actually want to accomplish those things, waste removal, transport, all those things, if we want that to happen, we can't rush it really. Now, there may be reasons why we actually don't want blood to flow through the capillary beds. We want to restrict that, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. But if we want diffusion to actually happen, we need to have that volume of blood flowing through the capillary beds. And so it's important, again, that the speed slows down, which it does, again, as the volume is increasing of going through those beds, and everything else is constant. So then your speed actually slows down. So your blood pressure, of course, is going to be highest, as I mentioned earlier, when the ventricles contract. That is your systolic pressure, right, in your blood pressure reading, and then lowest when they relax, and that's your diastolic pressure reading. Okay, so normally, right, you want your blood to sort of wander through your capillary beds, right, and spend some time there as they slow down, right, the volume increases, and the how fast the blood is moving actually slows down as it's going through the capillary beds, and that's going to maximize your rates of diffusion, right, because you're entering an area that has a really high surface area to volume ratio. But we can actually control, to a certain extent, the blood flow and the speed of blood flow, and exactly which parts of our bodies get, to a certain extent, like I said, get sufficient blood supply by constricting or dilating the arterioles that supply the capillary beds, right? So if we dilate them, right, you're going to increase the volume of blood that's going to that capillary bed, and it's going to spend more time there. And if you constrict it, then it's going to move more quickly. And we can take this to the next level, actually, by opening and closing smooth muscles, muscle rings around the vessels at the entrance to the beds. So you'll notice here, right, I've got my arteriole in red on the left. And as it's going into the capillary bed, right, the arterioles are starting to branch. And where it's branching, right, those branches are surrounded by sphincters, right? These are surrounded by little rings of smooth muscle. And if I contract the sphincter, right, that's going to constrict the blood vessel and essentially restrict access of the blood to those capillary beds. And what this means is, as you can see here, where those sphincters are contracted, so right, like right here and here and here, notice the capillary beds are kind of grayed out. So that means that the blood is not wandering through the capillary bed, but rather is being sort of speeded right on through. So it's almost like you have, instead of taking the surface streets, you're going to take the expressway, right? And you're going to go right through the center and into the veins and go back to the heart. And you might think, well, that seems like a waste of time. Why the heck would you do that, right? What circumstances would call for that? Again, if you want gas exchange, nutrient exchange, those kinds of things, you want the you want the blood to spend time in the capillary beds. But we have to remember, right, we have a fixed volume of blood, about 5 liters. And let's say there's certain parts of your body that are demanding an increase in blood supply. Say your skeletal muscle, your lungs, your brain as part of the fight or flight response, right? You only have so much blood, right? So if you tried to open up basically all of the arterioles everywhere to increase the volume of blood going through that particular area, right, that actually would drop your blood pressure across the board, and that's not something that we can sort of live with, right? Your blood pressure actually drops below a particular threshold. You're not getting enough blood supply to your brain and you pass out, so it's very not good. So you don't want that. So as part of that response, quite often our bodies will increase blood supply to certain organs and tissues, like I mentioned, increasing the blood supply to your heart, to your lungs, your brain, and your skeletal muscle, and decreasing blood supply to things that you just don't need to worry about if you're worried about fighting for your life or running for your life, right? You don't really need to be worrying about making pee, right? So you can go ahead and restrict blood flow to the capillary beds surrounding your kidneys. You can restrict blood flow to the capillary beds around your digestive tract, right? You don't really need to worry about nutrient absorption and nutrient transport, again, if you've got to run for your life or fight for your life. And that means that you can use that blood and you can send it elsewhere where it's most needed. So again, you can't open up all of your blood vessels all at once. That's going to cause a fatal drop in blood pressure. But what you can do is sort of reallocate access. And one of the ways we have of doing that is controlling these arterial sphincters and the precapillary sphincters so that the blood basically gets shunted where you want it. So again, blood that's not wandering through the capillary beds, but instead is moving on through, can instead be shipped elsewhere in the body where it's really is needed, rather than letting it wander through the beds. All right, and that is the end of our EdPuzzle lecture on the circulatory system.